Today I have for you another one of my alternate history ones. I haven't done one of these in a while, so I was anxious to do one again. I have What if Hitler was assassinated by Mr. Z? So with any of the alternate history videos, what I usually do is I watch the video and then I assess both the plausibility of what they're saying, how likely was it that this could have happened, in general and both in a specific scenario that they put out. I also look at what the outcome would be, what they say the outcome would be, and how much I agree with that. So let's go ahead and dive right in.
It should come as a little surprise that as the Second Great War geared up and bullets began to fly, that several attempts would be made on the life of German Chancellor and leader Adolf Hitler, one of the most powerful and controversial men then alive. Hitler is not unique in this regard, as similar threats existed to the lives of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, US President FDR, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin as well. What is unique, however, is one attempt in particular which could have very easily rearranged the European and global dynamic of power. The day is July 20th, 1944. The Normandy invasion is still underway. Italy is in the process of being brought under Allied occupation, and the eastern advance made by Germany was quickly receding. But Central Europe still remains well within German influence. In short, the tides were only just beginning to turn, but still some sense of the direction things were taking, and of course sought out an immediate means to bring about peace as to preserve the German people and state, as well as remove what these conspirators perceived as a government fixed on total war to the very last man standing. Plans to neutralize Hitler from within Germany's own government had been thrown around since late 1938, when it was feared his bold annexations and provocations would bring Germany into another world war. Expectedly, these efforts died down in the early years of the war when Germany seemed to maintain the upper hand, but once that collapsed, so did momentum pick back up. The increased intensity of British bombing raids against civilian and industrial targets within Germany would be the breaking point for one Colonel Henning von Tresckow, who would go on to establish a conspiratorial network within the German military to assassinate and replace Hitler. Von Tresckow's plots would fail repeatedly on account of missing parties, Hitler's tendency to deviate from schedule, and what could only be described as frustratingly minute factors not taken into account. Soon, von Tresckow's target would have moved beyond his reach, Hitler becoming more elusive as the war intensified, being more aware of the enemies who would wish to make an attempt on his life. It would only be upon von Tresckow's meeting with Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg toward the end of 1943 that an opportunity would once again present itself, as von Stauffenberg had regular access to Hitler at his East Prussian headquarters and was willing to commit the act himself. The plan, which today is commonly known as Operation Valkyrie, was meant to be fairly straightforward, however had several major issues. Just as an example, the means by which the assassination was to be carried out was through the use of two explosive charges placed in a briefcase at Hitler's side during a meeting. Von Stauffenberg was expected to carefully arm these charges despite only having the use of one eye and one hand, which only had 3 functional fingers. As might be expected, Stauffenberg was only able to arm one of the 2 charges. The briefcase, once placed, was then moved after von Stauffenberg excused himself from the room, leaving the reduced explosion to only cause 4 fatalities, only one of which was immediate, that being the stenographer, and none of which were Hitler himself. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Operation Valkyrie succeeded? Before going any further, let's take a minute to thank today's generous sponsor, Ridge Wallet. If you had to choose between a clunky old minivan and a sleek, stylish new sports car, which would it be? What if that sports car came with a lifetime guarantee, ensuring that no matter what goes wrong, you always have a car to drive? What if you didn't even need a lifetime guarantee, because the car was built to be virtually indestructible? There's a sleek new wallet waiting for you at Ridge. Let's assume that, say, von Stauffenberg had the time to arm both charges, placing Hitler within the kill zone, or perhaps the briefcases simply never moved. Likely, given how ineffective the blast was at causing fatalities, both of these factors would need to be in play to be immediately effective, and not simply injure Hitler, leaving open the possibility for a recovery. What was meant to follow from there was a speedy trip to Berlin by von Stauffenberg, where he would relay orders to the regular army informing them that Hitler was dead, a military provisional government was now in control, and chief members of the Nazi Party, being painted as the true actors behind the assassination, were to be arrested immediately. According to the plan, General Ludwig Beck was to succeed Hitler as head of state, taking the title of German president. Karl Friedrich Gordler of the pro-monarchist and conservative German National People's Party was to assume the role of German chancellor, while Social Democrat Wilhelm Leuschner would serve as vice-chancellor. Tresckow was to assume leadership over a reformed German security wing after Nazi party elements in the SS, SD, and Gestapo were purged. Von Stauffenberg's own position in government was undecided, but assumed to be state secretary to either the chancellor or the minister of war. The government would be replaced near entirely with a mix of centrist, conservative, social democrats, and military personnel, retaining only Albert Speer as the sole NSDAP minister in government on account of his perceived lukewarm politics and exceptional work as Minister of Armaments, though his actual success is often debated, critics claiming such success was only achieved through enforcement of brutal working conditions or fabricated altogether. Regardless, Speer's position in the new government was set, and his merely retaining a prominent role in German society leaves the door open for him to continue his earlier architectural work, no doubt playing a major role in rebuilding and redesigning Germany post-war. There was no guarantee that enough of the military would go along with the provisional government, and it was expected that resistance or even civil war might follow between the provisional anti-war faction and a National Socialist pro-war faction. It's difficult to say exactly who would emerge victorious, however we do know that quite a few generals were at least sympathetic to the anti-war faction, especially given the deteriorating state of the conflict. It's important to remember that the goal was to arrest party leadership quickly before the common soldiers loyal to the party realized who was really behind the plot, so that once resistance to the provisional government did emerge, it would be without capable guidance. In this regard, significant progress was made in capturing party leadership across German-occupied France, Austria, and Bohemia, suggesting that this would have proceeded effectively had the plot succeeded and continued. It's also important to keep in mind that many would see this as a traitorous move regardless of their party loyalty, as this change in leadership might have and realistically would have compromised Germany's military effort, leaving them at the mercy of the invading armies at this very crucial moment. The provisional government would have attempted to sign an armistice with the Allied powers and expected the support of Britain and the US in suppressing the NSDAP faction. However, and this is a key factor in why many generals were sympathetic to a regime change but unwilling to participate, US President FDR had, back in 1943, demanded of Germany and the Axis powers nothing short of total unconditional surrender, so that, quote, the Germans would know that they were defeated now and for all times, thus wiping out any chance for a peace negotiation. The existential threat this posed to Germany was so terrifying that the majority preferred to fight to the death rather than endure whatever unrestricted conditions the Americans, British, and Soviets might seek to impose. Now, the possibility does exist for an armistice to be accepted, by Britain especially, both to reduce the loss of life in needless war and prevent the Soviets from carving out a large chunk of German-occupied land for themselves. Inversely, the US and USSR both had reason to refuse. The Soviets, of course, preferred to weaken Germany as much as possible so they could expand their influence into Central Europe. And the US would refuse to back down as to not appear weak in front of Japan, with whom it was still at war, and determined to severely punish alongside Germany for their constant warmongering. However, factions within the US also saw Germany as an important asset for a potential post-war conflict with the USSR, leaving it somewhat divided between both camps. So as to prevent a timeline where the war simply continues only slightly different from our own world, let's assume that Britain and the US accept the armistice independent of the Soviet Union, granting them free movement through much of German-occupied Europe and allowing them to overpower remnant NSDAP forces. Assuming negotiations go as well as the conspirators had hoped, Germany was to retain annexed Austria, the Sudetenland, the Polish Corridor, and Alsace-Lorraine, as well as French Cameroon. Realistically, the provisional government would not be in any position to be making such demands. However, assuming a best-case scenario for them, we could imagine that the independent peace deals sent to the USSR and Western powers are made more competitive. As an example, the provisional government's foreign minister was to be determined based upon who responded to the peace offer first. In this alternate timeline, Germany's undivided support in post-war Europe is what was on the table. The Soviets by this point were advancing quickly and would soon have all their essential territories, though Germany could still offer support and recognition of Soviet influence over lands in the Balkans. That said, this deal is far more likely to entice Britain, who would have only just begun advancing beyond Normandy and now face the possibility of a willingly pro-Soviet Germany. That's of course just one way German demands might be accepted, but however this is achieved for the sake of this scenario, we'll just assume the provisional government's plan goes exactly as they anticipated. In that time, the Soviets would bring Romania, Bulgaria, and Estonia under occupation. However, Germany is able to hold on to land as far east as the Latvian coast, while the Western powers initiated their own occupation of the remaining Balkans. Germany is allowed to emerge from the conflict with much of its infrastructure, population, major cities, and pre-war borders intact, retaining a small sphere of influence in north-central Europe, including Finland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Croatia as a buffer to Soviet expansion. Because Germany remains strong in this post-war world, it has far less incentive to throw its lot in with France and establish the foundations for the European Union we know today. However, given Britain's post-war insistence on European integration, Germany may find itself pulled into the arrangement regardless, though encouraging Britain to play a more active role in what would become the EU, as to prevent it from becoming a German-dominated union. Aside from mainland politics, an earlier end to the war also leaves Britain in a better state to maintain its colonial possessions, though still the election of the Labour Party following the war, and pressure from the US, would ensure Britain carry out decolonization willingly. Germany would attempt to make use of its newly restored colonial resources and consider long-term plans for expansion in Africa, especially once decolonization came into play for France and Belgium, as Germany stood more capable of intervening in former colonies, most especially the Congo. Pressures to decolonize would eventually be placed on Germany, who'd be more than reluctant to give up the colony they'd just reacquired, possibly leading them down a path much like Portugal, engaged in colonial wars alongside South Africa and Rhodesia, while being economically penalized by the US and UK. Germany's apparent post-war gains would not exclude them from a hefty war debt, shared pressures to decolonize, and obligation to Britain, though this debt would be paid off quicker and easier thanks to Germany's now greater manpower and industry. Disarming Germany was also to be a key condition in Germany's surrender, however several issues stand in the way of this. For one, if we're operating under the assumption that Britain has only accepted peace to retain Germany as a capable Soviet deterrent, then demilitarizing Germany would defeat that purpose. The provisional government had no intention of demilitarizing either, something which would have been another hurdle to overcome when negotiating a peace deal, but again we're assuming Britain recognizes the USSR as a greater threat than Germany, and is willing to groom the new German government into a powerful ally. Realistically, Germany would have been out of luck from day one. The collapse of government order and the civil unrest that would follow the assassination would only make Germany's conquest all the quicker, though probably no less grueling for the Germans themselves. Again, for the sake of this scenario, we're just assuming the new government gets everything it wants. The provisional government, though it would embody a wider ideological spectrum, did not plan to fully embrace democratic principles, and such was not historically unusual for Germany's government. Monarchist and nationalist ideology would still retain a dominant and central position in both the public and governing mind, President Beck having been a strong opponent of the Versailles Treaty, and a supporter of strong central government restored to pre-Great War levels. Meanwhile, ruling Chancellor Gordeler had long planned to restore one of the former Kaiser's sons to the throne in a constitutionally restrained position. Truly what seemed to be desired most of all was simply a return to imperial normality, with minor reforms to correct mistakes which had been learned from in the past 2 decades. From its borders to politics and colonial desires, Germany just wanted a second chance to be the empire it once was. In that respect, Germany would not be thrilled to find itself subject to Britain's whim, however President Beck was a patient and tactical man. He stood by the belief that Germany's first priority should be military advancement, regardless of if it took years or decades. Germany must bide its time until it reached a level of unparalleled military strength in Europe. Its role as gatekeeper and guardian of the battle-worn Western European powers from the Eastern Communist tide would place it precisely where it needed to be to achieve this. Germany's strength being essential to Russia's containment would prevent Britain and the West from hindering German military development. Meanwhile, German cooperation on all other matters of foreign policy, economics, intelligence sharing, and so on would lull the West into a false sense of security, believing Germany to finally be subdued, though just beneath the surface German nationalism and ambition would remain strong, waiting for the day it might once again make a grab for continental power. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching.
Alright, so the assassination of Hitler in Operation Valkyrie, actually pretty likely. It was sheer chance it didn't work. What he doesn't mention is that originally the meeting in which this happened was supposed to happen in a bunker. Now bunkers are designed to repel explosions from the outside, but if one happens on the inside, then it just sort of bounces everything back inward, making it that much deadlier. So even only having one active explosive in the briefcase would have been enough to kill pretty much everybody in the room. Especially Hitler, if he was even on that side of the room, he would have been dead. However, Hitler decided that it was a nice day not joking, he decided it was a nice day and decided to have the meeting in a cabin that was on the premises instead. Now, a wooden cabin does not deflect explosions the same way that a concrete bunker does. So when the bomb went off, the table went up and the walls and windows shattered, but there was very little actual death or really injury, because most of the shock was absorbed by the building itself and not deflected that the way it would have been in the bunker. So had that not changed, had it not been a nice day, yeah, it probably would have worked. Absolutely. There are other instances, many instances in which he was almost assassinated. There were many attempts on his life. One of the more interesting ones is the Oster conspiracy, which takes place in 1938. Basically, it was a conspiracy of high-ranking German military officials outside of the Nazi Party that decided if Hitler started a war over his claim over Czechoslovakia, they were going to overthrow Hitler and then sue for peace with the Allies before it could get out of control. They knew that Germany was not ready for a war. They do not want one. It really wasn't until the successes of Poland and France that a lot of the army was much more on board with things. But at first, they really didn't want it. They didn't want to go up against the Allies. They weren't ready. They didn't think they were ready. So that's a very interesting one. But of course, it never happened because he got Czechoslovakia without a fight. So that's the thing. But that's one of the more interesting ones. So there's many scenarios in which he could have been assassinated. Now, sticking to the one he chose, Operation Valkyrie, is probably one of the more likely ones. A lot of them are pretty unlikely, or they were convoluted in the plans, not very well thought out. So had this happen, then because they had such a well thought out after plan for putting together a new government, a provisional government, this probably would have been the best one to do. The Oster conspiracy, they had a pretty good plan too. It was very similar. They knew who was going to be put in power, and the military was going to basically purge the Gestapo and the SS and all them, which was a lot smaller at that time. It was much, much smaller in 38 than it was in 44, so it would have been a much easier coup. But in this particular instance, speed was of the essence to make sure that you got rid of these top guys before any of them could squeal. But this was probably one of the most likely scenarios. This is, ones that would have been worked the best. I know that they did want to sue for peace. That would have happened. Now he talks about the British definitely would have gone for it. They were looking to end the war. They wanted to stop the Nazis. They wanted to stop the Nazis. I think Churchill may have dragged his feet a little bit, but would have been stuck with taking the offer. Churchill definitely wanted to end the Nazi regime. He wanted to end Germany, but ending the war was a little more important, and having an ally in Germany against the Soviet Union would have been more important, because in the Oster conspiracy, the officers that were plotting actually had French and British support. That if they pulled it off, the British and French were going to support them. However, Chamberlain turns around and gives Czechoslovakia over to Hitler in a Munich conference and completely throws that whole thing out, which the German officers were very upset about because they thought that Britain had their back, and then suddenly here it is, Britain's giving away Czechoslovakia. Because some of them really wanted Hitler gone, even at that point. But but for this other case, now he talked about the United States being reluctant. I don't think they would have been. I don't think the United States really worried about appearing weak to the Japanese, because by mid 1944, Japanese were not doing well. The Americans clearly had the upper hand. They had already been started bombing the Japanese mainland. They had taken back pretty much everything of real value. Most of the Navy had been sunk. I mean, the Americans were dominating. To make the Japanese think that they're weak would just be silly. Because clearly the Japanese at this point knew the Americans were not weak. They may have, at worst, tried to negotiate a little harder at the end, but been a little more resistant to surrender. But I don't know to what extent, if any. I think the Americans definitely would have been on board, because their anger was at the Japanese, not at the Germans. So there's a lot of anti-German propaganda that was put on that really got Americans geared against the Nazis, but realistically the anger was against Japan, because they're the ones that attacked the United States. So I don't think that the United States would have a problem with it. In fact, the United States would probably be the one pushing Britain to do it more. British Parliament probably would have been pushing FDR. No, I'm sorry, Winston Churchill and FDR probably would have been pushing them too. And I'm sure Eisenhower would have been. Eisenhower would have been all over it. I think he would be getting pressure from all sides to do it. And I think Churchill's the one that you'd have to convince, and I think he would have done it. Maybe reluctantly, but he would have done it, because he did see the Soviet Union as being a massive threat. He built his career on anti-communism. He just saw Nazism as a bigger threat. So he sort of changed his attention over to that, because Stalin wasn't that expansionist in the way that Hitler was. Yeah, they definitely would not have disarmed Germany, because they would have needed them against the Soviets. The Soviets weren't going to stop. There was going to be no peace deal with the Soviets. There's no doubt in my mind the Soviets were going to keep going. They wanted revenge. I mean, some of the worst atrocities that were committed in Russia and the Soviet Union had already been committed. Soviets had already taken massive losses and nearly lost Moscow. They wanted revenge. They wanted to end Germany. And that's what Stalin was going to do. He wasn't going to take any kind of peace deal. Especially considering that this new German government was not communist. I don't think he would have made a deal with anyone who was not communist. And even if they were communists, he probably would have enforced his own Stalinist views onto them. But the Soviets weren't going to stop, and I think that the British and the Americans would have had to come to the aid of Germany and sign an alliance in order to try and get the Soviets to stop. Hand them Eastern Europe and call it a day. But yeah, I don't think that the Soviets would have stopped without that. With the combined forces of the United States, Britain, and a fully, at this point, still a very strong Germany. I don't think that Stalin would have gone on at that point. I don't think he would have taken on Germany and the West. Germany was tough enough. And at this point, Mussolini was his way out. Italy was not doing well, and it was really the Germans holding the line. So without that, Italy easily falls, and Mussolini's ousted. Franco's not really involved in anything, so I think they just leave him alone. But yeah, no, I mostly agree with what he's saying. I just don't think that Germany's going to get everything that they want. They're not. Because Churchill's not going to let them. He's just not. And the Soviets, there's no way that they're going to sign peace with just Germany. They're going to need to have the Americans and the British backing up Germany militarily in order to stop. And even then, it's a little iffy. They might continue to go on, because Stalin does think that they're going to have to fight the West. I just don't think he wants to fight the United States. He would fight Britain, but I don't think he wants to fight the United States. but I think that it would have taken the alliance of those groups, and but no, I definitely think that the Americans and the British would have taken the deal. They would have taken the deal, ended the war, and then tried to stop the Soviets and try to work out a deal with them. Again, Churchill probably would have pushed for a go, 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 and I'm sure that General Patton would have too, but working out a deal with the Soviets would have been more beneficial. You just hand them, like I said, hand them Eastern Europe, call it a day. End the war right there. But, so in terms of plausibility, yeah, it's pretty plausible. The plan itself is actually pretty solid, and even though its execution in terms of breaking the bombs was not great, it was still enough to kill Hitler in a bunker. It still was. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there's actually a great book. I have it somewhere over there. That's just on Operation Valkyrie. I'll put a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. This particular one, I'm sure there's 100 different ones, but the particular one that I've read, I'll put a link to it in the description if you're interested. It's definitely an interesting read. Yeah, so just to summarize, yeah, I think it's very plausible, and I think that Germany would have gotten somewhat they wanted. I think that the West would have absolutely signed the deal with them, and they would have had to give up Eastern Europe to the Soviets, let Stalin expand his influence in order to pacify Stalin, because he's not going to stop just because the Nazis aren't there anymore, just because Hitler's dead. He's not going to stop. He wants revenge. But I don't think he's going to take on the United States with Britain and Germany. Like, I think that is enough of a force to even convince Stalin that this isn't a good idea. Because the Americans had Japan pretty much, I don't want to say beaten at this point, but it's pretty obvious that the United States was probably going to win. It was still going to take some time, but they're probably going to win, which, if the United States wins there, they already have a presence in a number of islands in the Philippines, so if they win Japan, now they're going to attack the Soviet Union from the other side. I mean, plus they could technically come in from Alaska. So, I mean, it really puts the Soviets in a precarious position to try to fight the Americans. Little did they know that the atomic bomb is coming. But that would be a changer too. But, yeah, I don't think that Stalin would have taken them all on, but that would have been the only thing that would have stopped him. And he would have wanted something. He wouldn't have stopped for nothing. He would have wanted something. So Eastern Europe and probably part of the Balkans would have gone to him, if not the entirety of the Balkans, but most of them at least. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. If you have any other videos you want me to check out, whether history or alternate history, please put in the comment section. I'll definitely check them out. I'm building a list. I haven't gotten to a lot of them yet, but I'm building a list. Once I finish a lot of these series, I'll take on new ones. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.